Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Oh my God. You guys seem awake and everything. That's excellent. Okay. So I want to start off by welcoming everyone to Sonic Scene's Symposium. We have a great many institutions, programs, agencies, and individuals to thank for allowing us to be here today. Our sincere gratitude goes out to the Women's and Gender Studies program at MIT, Director Helen Elaine Lee and Emily Neal, but particularly Sophia Hassenfuss in the back, who has managed everything. Who has managed everything from hotel reservations, food orders, and my incessant email questions. The literature section at MIT, the chair, Mary Fuller, Ed Bertschinger, who's here, back here, at the Institute Community and Equity Office, the Council for the Arts at MIT, and the Institute of Contemporary Art, Boston. I need to pause here and say that for the Council for the Arts at MIT, it's like this adorable audition process where you like go in and you like pitch your event and they say, how is it related to art? And then you tell them and then they give you money. So that was fun. We would not be here today without the energy and diligence of MIT faculty member Sandy Alexander. Sandy is a member of the Dark Room. She is my MLK visiting scholar mentor. She is a friend, and she is someone who always says things like, well, let's find some money then. Today's event is the 6th gathering of the group of scholars and artists who make up the Dark Room, Race and Visual Culture Studies Seminar. My name is Kimberly Juanita Brown, and I am the founder and convener of the Dark Room. We are the purposeful result of years of interdisciplinary scholarship, collaboration, and creative engagement. These are our more recent publications. I know, right? The Darkroom is a working group of women of color artists and scholars whose work gathers at the intersection of critical race theory and visual culture studies. Our first session began with 11 members, and we are now hovering around 70 members at 54 institutions of higher learning in the United States and Canada. Darkroom members are historians, sociologists, art practitioners, literary critics, art historians, feminist scholars, performance studies scholars, anthropologists, and film and media scholars. Since 2012, we have been meeting to read recent published works that concern race and visual culture. At our very first meeting in September of 2012, we read Tina Camp's Image Matters, Archive, Photography, and the African Diaspora in Europe. And this past September, we read Tina's newest work, Listening to Images. Tina Camp is the only scholar that this group has read twice. It is only fitting then to have as one of our keynote speakers today, a scholar of her import and range for this important event. And we thank her for agreeing to participate. Our conversation concerning Listening to Images was circular, layered, and vibrant as our Twitter discussion shows. So these are just a few of our screen grabs. We can send you copies of this if you really want it, so you can see how we engage the work. We are still sitting with the archival investigation located in this text. Multimedia artist Roshini Kempadu merges the residue of history with its lingering imprint, and this is her image for our poster for the event today. A visual production that both invites the viewer to participate as a witness and indicts the archive. With work that is hauntingly layered, her images embody sight and sound. You really have to listen to them in order to grasp the full power of their meaning. We are so excited to have her here with us today. Roshini and Tina will join the incredible women of the Darkroom as they present their research. And as I do every year, I want to thank them for their brilliance, their insight, the depth of their engagement, and their good humor. The highest compliment that I can give to someone is to say that I love your eye, the way that you look at the world. and I do. I love your eyes, and so thank you for that. And lastly, we now have 5 darkroom babies. So Kelly Carter Jackson gave us our first and our third, William and Josephine. And Brenna gave us our second. And Doreen gave us our fourth. And Sandy's daughter is 3 weeks old, our 5th darkroom baby. This is yet another legacy of the darkroom. And with this legacy, there will be new ways of seeing and being seen, new ways of navigating the world of the visual, new stories to tell. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. So I'm Vanessa Liles, and I'm a new member of the darkroom, very proud of it. And I will be your moderator for this panel and all others. And so I will start by reading the bios in order of presentation, and then the ladies will start with their brilliant work. Jasmine Elizabeth Johnson is an assistant professor of theater arts and performance studies. Johnson's work examines the politics of Black movement, including dance, diasporic travel, and gentrification. Interdisciplinary in nature, her research and teaching is situated at the intersection of diaspora theory, dance, and performance studies, ethnography, and Black feminism. Her current book project, Rhythm Nation, West African Dance and the Politics of Diaspora, is a transnational ethnography of the study of West African dance. A Ford Foundation Diversity Fellow, Johnson received her PhD in African Diaspora Studies from UC Berkeley. Johnson serves on the board of the Collegium of African Diaspora Dance, the Society of Dance History Scholars, and the editorial board of Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society. She is also a dancer and performs internationally. Second, Christina Knight is an assistant professor of visual studies at Haverford, as well as the director of visual studies program. Before joining the Haverford faculty, she was a consortium of faculty diversity postdoctoral fellow at Bowdoin College, as well as a Ford Foundation Diversity Fellow. Knight's work examines the connection between embodied practices and identity, the relationship between race in the visual field and the queer imaginary. Her current book project focuses on representations of the Middle Passage in contemporary American visual art and performance. She is also a director and co-founder of the dance theater company Nightworks. Toby Sisson is an abstract artist whose individual studio practice encompasses mixed media drawing, oil, and encaustic painting. Her visual studies range from the creation of land-based art forms to the hybridization of indigenous and immigrant artistic traditions, as well as the innovative use of ancient and organic materials. Her work has been exhibited in solo and select group shows and acquired for numerous private collections. Simpson's creative research and teaching interests are also engaged in community-based art. She teaches at Clark University in Massachusetts. Amanda Russhell Wallace is a multimedia, multidisciplinary interested artist. Her work ranges from documentary, family photography, to current experiments with time-based media. Many of her projects explore internal and external social identities. She considers the notion that cultural identity and acceptance are based on the remnants of speech, text, and imagery gathered and carried in various pockets of the brain throughout time. These remnants are used to represent the associations and typologies we use to form, assign to ourselves and others, and perform identity daily, whether at home, work, the public, or online or on social media. Her artwork is exhibited nationally and internationally. And Amah Edoh is a cultural anthropologist interested in the politics of knowledge production, specifically knowledge about Africa and Africans, as made visible through objects, making, using, and circulation. Her current book project, based on her PhD dissertation, is a multi-sided ethnography tracing the trajectory of Dutch wax cloth, aka wax Hollandized Ankara African print, from design and marketing in Holland to selling, buying, and tailoring in Lomé, Togo. Taking each of these ways of doing Dutch wax cloth as a different prism, the ethnography looks at how the new Africa, aka Africa Rising, aka the African Renaissance, is negotiated across European and West African sites. It argues that the new Africa is characterized by tenuous play between absence and presence, visibility and invisibility, inclusion and exclusion of African forms and bodies in the world order. And that is our panel for now. And we will start with Jasmine Elizabeth Johnson.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for the bios and for moderating. It is really a joy to be here, and I'm grateful always to Kimberly, Juanita Brown for leading us so fearlessly and making spaces for us all. Yeah. And thank you all for being here. I'm gonna hop in because I know time is not on our side. The title of my talk is A Politics of Tenderness, Camille A. Brown and Dancer's Black Girl Linguistic Play. In 1989, renowned scholar of Black women's history, Darlene Clark Hine, published an essay, Rape in the Inner Lives of Black Women. In it, she considers the migration of Black American women from the South to the Midwest between 1915 and 1945. Clark Hine argues that in order to understand the movement practiced by Black women during this period, one must understand the non-economic imperatives for Black female migration. Both a desire for personal autonomy and a freedom from sexual exploitation, she writes, encouraged Black women to relocate. She writes, quote, because of the interplay of racial animosity, class tensions, gender role differentiation, and regional and economic variations, Black women, as a rule, developed and adhered to a cult of secrecy, a culture of dissemblance, to protect the sanctity of the inner aspects of their lives, end quote. This culture of dissemblance was an appearance of disclosure, an openness that safeguarded an inner life. Thus, Black women dressed up deliberate abstraction as forthrightness, in a political, economic, and social context in which the fact of one's Black womanhood made them susceptible to a range of violences. The culture of dissemblance functioned as a psychic shelter that allowed Black women to operate with spirit intact, even if their physical body remained vulnerable. Notwithstanding prevalent stereotypes rooted in flattened assumptions about Black women's sexuality, Black women authored more approximate, empowering evaluations of themselves. This secret, undisclosed persona allowed the individual Black woman to function, to work effectively as domestic in white households, to endure the frustration-born violence of frequently or unemployed mates, to support churches, found institutions, and to engage in service activities, all while living within a clearly hostile, white, patriarchal, middle-class America. Clark Hine argues that a culture of dissemblance was practiced as a rule in direct confrontation to the injurious forces of racial stereotypes and culture of sexual violence that those stereotypes buttressed. It ultimately recognized Black women's capacity to self-define and safeguard self-possession in spite of society's structural enmity toward them. The culture of dissemblance is ultimately a clandestine protection. It does not announce itself. It does not publicize its commitment to safety. It addresses adult Black women saving themselves vis-a-vis strategic psychic administration. Although we are more than 7 decades past the migratory period that Clark Hine examines, Black women continue to experience the detrimental effects of ongoing racial and gender violence. Black American women, as Melissa Harris Perry has written, have always had to wrestle with derogatory assumptions of their character and identity. These assumptions shape the social world that Black women must accommodate or resist in an effort to preserve their authentic selves and secure recognition as citizens. The work of Black feminist scholars, including Amy Cox, Kira Gaunt, Tamara Harris, and Monique Morris, among many, many others, have focused on the contemporary conditions of Black girlhood, from the school-to-prison pipeline to sexual violence to examinations of mental health. Their collective and awesome body of work situate today's Black girls as historical echoes of the migrant women at the heart of Clark Hine's examination. Actually inspired by both Clark Hine and Kira Gaunt, the games that Black girls play. Black girl linguistic play originated through a frustration with stereotypes. The performance elaborates unspoken rhythm and language that Black girls have through double dutch, social dances, and hand clapping games that are both contemporary and, according to Camille Brown, contemporary and ancestral. Brown says that Black girl linguistic play stems from a central question: who was I? before the world defined me. By Camille A. Brown and Dancers, a New York-based ensemble led by the company's founder and director, Camille A. Brown. The work opens to a scene. An airy stage with 4 raised black boxes of varying heights and length are positioned throughout. For this upstage, a chalkboard is mounted. Neon drawings fill up the panel's expanse. A medley of bright stars, flowers, hearts, and boxy shapes decorate this chalk world. A electric guitar jolts the scene. Soon, a piano will camber in, punctuating the supple guitar pluck with the piano's soft chime. Here is a black girl world. Not because the show's title implores you to believe this, but because its movement, soundscape, and performance world declare this fact. Working to reveal the complexity of carving out a self-defined identity as a black woman in urban America culture, Black Girl Linguistic Play confronts, quote, a society where black women are often only portrayed in terms of their strength, resiliency, or trauma. It consequently confronts these demands by representing a nuanced spectrum of black womanhood and a racially and politically charged world. So I analyzed the work, the black feminist work, what I argue is black feminist work that Black Girl Linguistic Play accomplishes in drawing from dance theory, black feminism, critical viewings of the performance, and interviews I conducted with the show's choreographer, dancers, dramaturgs, composer, pianist, and sound designer. I propose a politics of tenderness to elucidate the black feminist work that Black Girl Linguistic Play animates. It privileges the lives and experiences of black girls and thus requires audiences to focus their attention to intersectional adolescence within and against a society in which a black girl's person is presumed to be both transparent and stereotypical. Black Girl Linguistic Play, in other words, stages the nuance of black women through the passageway of girlhood. I think it also extends a method of black women's survival that differs, interesting that it's inspired, but differs drastically from the culture of dissemblance. So Brown and the company engages this politics of tenderness, which is rather than performing composure in order to circumvent the harm being done to oneself, this work excavates the complexity of black women's experiences, both joyful and potentially harmful, through the vector of black girlhood. So a politics of tenderness mobilizes the interiority of black girlhood as a way to tend to the intricacy of black womanhood. A politics of tenderness is a softness inside and through bodies imagined as gnarled and embittered. In this light, we might understand a politics of tenderness as tasting for sweet when we expect bitter, sour tongue. It's organized by a triptych of duets, each partnership progressively maturing in age. Brown inaugurates the work with her solo, which you just saw. Here, it is as if the guitar and piano function as her hammock. The warmth of the lights tell us that we are both here and not here, that our presence as an audience for this girl in this opening scene might very well be inconsequential. In the early moments, there is a tension between a black girl belonging to herself and everyone else's utility for a black girl. The show starts with Tracy Warmworth perched on a stool. She's lit from above, a soft wreath of light crowning her head. The piano leans into Brown, wearing jean shorts, a cropped red jacket, hoop earrings. She's facing a chalk wall. She slowly turns around to face the audience, gathers breath in the harbor between her chin and her chest. Brown takes up space while fighting invisible restraints. At one moment, she's puff-chest and full of sass, and the next moment, she is clipped by some unseen yet authoritarian force. A black girl nerve eventually pokes through, a hip wiggle here, a shoulder bounce there. Softened voices of children playing add texture to the piano and guitar that are already underway. This world is someplace between lullaby and manifesto. Brown increasingly feels herself. She hops off the platform as the music picks up. Her movements swell in scope and in size. She sweeps her arm to the ground and then raises hand to the sky. She rocks, rocks, rocks into a double dutch that she makes with the rhythm of her own feet. A constant relationship between the earth and the clouds remain. She gathers some flowered chalk. It billows around her. In this opening solo, we get budding teenager learning the range of her own body's flexibility. The WAP, Beyonce single ladies dance, slow party vibes, salsa partnering without the partner. She is amalgam of the moves her grandmother, mother, televised superstars exact. Some of these dances are in her. She is trying on others. At the same time, this black girl seems to become aware that her body in motion can gather attentions. After a bit of performed boredom and impatience, the music stops. Brown begins to make her own. Hand clapping and foot stomping are the only sounds in the theater as Catherine Foster enters and the two women play within each other's rhythm. So the first duet is danced by Catherine Foster and Camille Brown, and their playmates. We hear Shimmy Shimmy Cocoa Pop, Grandma Grandma Sick in Bed, and Down Down Baby. They pop one hip out. Foster pets her own hair with her head cocked to the side. And so here we see social dances of past and present being enacted. The Harlem Shake, the Whip Nay Nay make appearances, as always. The two share quiet and encourage each other's laughter. They swing 1, 2, 3 into an upper platform and into a double dutch game. And then briefly, the Charleston manifests. They call and response Gigolo Game, which is an animated and rhymed introduction of oneself. And then they end softly, without announcement, and on their own terms, they eventually exit. In the second duet by Patrice Capote and Fauna Frazier, there's a strong bond that anchors these two women, even during and after they fight. The two girls skip around town like they just received money from their mothers and are off to exchange it for a treat. Soon, they are back at home, flipping through television channels. They watch the representations spill onto their bodies and into their estimation of themselves. One dances cute, the other tries on sexy. The wall brightens up, and Frazier is dancing for an audience that is suddenly not her friend. She lets her butt poke out and falls over, unable to balance this new imagined weight. Capote watches on and appears entertained in Frazier's flirt with the expectation that black girls should always already move like women. A competition for attentions builds up, both temporarily seduced into thinking that there's only room for one and that mastering one's hypersexual body is the only way to secure that slot. Their movements begin to ingratiate each other. Who is this audience for which they are performing and competing? They tussle, all the while committed to their embodiment of black women perfection, even as young girls. Once harmful images enter, they begin to hold each other back. But rather than positioning this fight as an end to friendship, the harm, annoyance, and competition is also framed as tender play. Capote cries while Frazier performs indifference. Ultimately, Capote exorcises herself, heaving upward toward the sky, then cowering low. Clemency blossoms. They reconnect by sharing in a rhythm. Soft, airy movements replace the jagged, sexually aspirational ones. Cheer returns. Here are two girls growing next to and against one another, calibrating their own relationship with the world's imposition of how they should be. As the two enjoy each other's company while learning competition, we learn that a sisterly bond does not mean that the wicked don't enter. Mm-hmm. A connection between two black girls can be as smooth as butter or as fussy as taffy. In this work, black girls' friendship is not a chimera, but a rumination. In some ways, Black girl linguistic play reflects on who we were as black women before being mired down by presumptions of who we are. As Amy Cox writes, quote, "This is what it feels, after having seen the show, this is what it feels like to have yourself handed back to you, to be honored with the gift of your contradictory, hard-won, still in process, beautifully flawed, inimitable self. This is what people want you to feel when they casually say, I feel you. This is what it might feel like to live in a world where you are seen," end quote. So, a politics of tenderness can be understood as both a rehearsal strategy and a performance outcome that explores Black women's interiority. As a Black feminist practice, the politics of tenderness asks both performance collaborators and audiences to recognize Black girls as sentient, as fleshy, as of history. Thus, Black girl linguistic play is not tender because it begs for external attention to validate Black girlhood. It is supple precisely because it decides to privilege Black women's experiences as worthy of examination, reflection, and innovation. To be tender, then, is about a Black girl facing inside to fan herself out, both to herself and to her peers. It does not merely add Black women to a conversation already underway in which they are absent. Rather, it is an applied practice of Black feminist understanding. As Brown has told me, I felt a huge responsibility, what I felt good about but was also scared of. So this show asks us what it might mean to consider Black girlhood as an embodied technique without falling into the trap of essentialism, to understand Black girls as deserving of living past the rubric of innocence. A politics of tenderness is not merely presenting Black girls in a favorable light. It's not elevating the glorious without the wretched. It is a practice of complicated care. It is giving yourself the Black girl right to turn to yourself without a compulsion to translate for others. This exercise in self-interest is not vain, but vital survival strategy. Thank you.
We'll have time for questions at the end. Next, Christina Knight.
Good morning. I too want to be quick with my thank yous, but I need to say them. Kimberly, Juanita, Brown, it is always an honor to be in your presence. But also just wanted to thank everyone in this room. Every time I have some new work, I always want to bring it here because there's a kind of ethics to the way that people share work and listen to work and hold work here. So excited to hear your thoughts on this. At the beginning of Isaac Julien's dialogue-free 1993 work, The Attendant, a closeted Black museum worker encounters a white, leather-clad museum goer as the eponymous attendant is inspecting bags. What follows is a dreamscape in which a 19th century Francois-Auguste Billard painting seen on the African coast comes to life as a series of S&M-inflected tableaux vivants. After the museum's closing, we follow the attendant and the anonymous museum goer into a room lined with Tom of Finland paintings and watch as they take turns flogging each other. Finally, the short film concludes with the attendant in the box of an opera house singing Dido's Lament from Henry Purcell's Dido and Aeneas, as partially clothed men pose in a new tableau on stage. As the attendant sings the famous aria, "Remember me, but forget my fate," both the museum goer and the attendant's putative wife, the conservator, look on somberly. Set in Wilberforce House in Hull, England, The Attendant is a work that disrupts historiographies of slavery in two ways. First, Julien indicts a British national identity that commemorates its abolition of the slave trade through figures like William Wilberforce. The nostalgic focus on white abolitionism erases the experiences of the enslaved, as well as the barriers to inclusion faced by their descendants. In Julien's view, the film also pushes back against a straight, Afrocentric historiography that narrowly reads slavery through a master-slave dialectic. This model both robs the enslaved of their agency and ignores the complicated workings of desire within slavery. In today's talk, I argue that by centering a gay S&M practice, Julien insists on something nevertheless more broadly applicable to Afro-diasporic subjects. By suggesting the power of an embodied relationship to both history and its representation, the filmmaker ultimately posits a relationship to the enslaved that does not inherit their trauma. It's worth asking why Julien includes S&M elements in a film engaging the legacy of slavery in representations like the BR. First, by doing so, he sends up the sexuality hiding in plain sight in the original. A 19th century review of Scene on the African Coast includes the following description. The scene is laid upon the African coast. Yonder is a poor woman kneeling before a Frenchman. Her shoulder is fizzing under the hot iron with which he brands her. She is looking up, shuddering and wild, yet quite mild and patient. It breaks your heart to look at her. I never saw anything so exquisitely pathetic as that face. God bless you, Monsieur Billard, for painting it. It stirs the heart more than 1,000 tracts, reports, or sermons. It must convert every man who has seen it, every man indeed. Including this review in his discussion of the Billard painting, slavery scholar Marcus Wood argues that the violence of the image was tacitly arousing to contemporary audiences. The reviewer focuses on the women in the painting, even though they aren't central to the action, and he lingers on the quiet suffering of the woman being branded. Wood goes on to tell us that Thackeray was not alone in singling out the branding of the topless beauty as a point of particular interest. It reappears in woodcut form, cut out from the rest of the picture, and countless variations. Here, Julien's film highlights this sexualized, prurient undercurrent of much abolitionism, as well as histories of slavery from more recent eras. By removing the black women entirely in his remaking of the painting as tableau vivant, Julien disrupts the tacitly heterosexual circuit of desire that orients both the world of the Billard as well as the relationship it posits between viewer and painting. To go further, this physical activation of Billard's masters and slaves within the slick, stylized costuming of S&M suggests a reworked relationship to the history of slavery and its attendant trauma for diasporic subjects. As queer theorist Elizabeth Freeman reminds us, however one views S&M, it is inescapably true that the body in sadomasochistic ritual becomes a means of invoking history, personal pasts, collective suffering, and quotidian forms of injustice in an idiom of pleasure. That is its scandal and its promise. Quite plainly, Julien's film suggests that playing out these historical roles, whether in the realm of the imagination or in actual sexual play, offers the attendant of the film's title great pleasure. For example, upon meeting the unnamed museum visitor, a campy Cupid figure circles the head of the attendant. Meanwhile, a tiny pitchfork-wielding devil circles the visitor when the attendant discovers a whip in his bag. Though one reviewer suggests that the devil reinforces the white visitor's power over the love-struck attendant in a remaking of colonial relationships, I think it's more useful to point out that both the devil and Cupid carry weapons. Power in this encounter is something to negotiate and exchange. And further, this exchange of power is also an exchange of pleasure for both parties. Perhaps more importantly, can a piece that includes such campy figures be read only at face value? Reading the action of the attendant as simply reenacting historical power asymmetries, and in doing so, performing Black self-hatred, misses the critical work of camp parody in the piece. In writing about the work, Julien poses the following questions. If today a Black gay man was to participate in such an act for sexual pleasure, could not the resulting representation of interracial S&M be read as parody? Or would it be moralistically read into the cheap sociology of a pathological Black self-hating discourse? In other words, a less obvious interpretation of this work is that it exposes expectations around how Black subjects should appropriately respond to representations of slavery. And further, it suggests the ways that they are policed when they don't comply. That is, in addition to the trope of the passive and suffering Black slaves supported by the visual culture of abolitionism, there is an equally limiting trope of Black slave resistance. Neither option leaves much room for a gay Black man who enjoys leather. Julien's strategy fits into a longer history of gay artists of color engaging camp humor or parody to redirect limiting mainstream representations, in this case, of course, the Billard painting's relationship to the history of slavery. For instance, one could argue that the naturalistic quality of Scene on the African Coast suggests an Atlantic world as it truly was. This representational strategy manufactures a version of slavery that centers on beautiful, passive victims and barbarous masters, meanwhile reassuring the British people of their moral high ground and pushing for its abolition. In Notes on Camp, Susan Sontag famously writes, "Camp is not a natural mode of sensibility, if there be any such. Indeed, the essence of camp is its love of the unnatural, of artifice, of exaggeration." Yet Julien's inclusion of Cupids, the low art of tableau vivant, and the hyperbolic opera he includes powerfully disrupts an easy and thoughtless reception of representation as history. In other words, more than just calling our attention to surface through kitsch, Julien's remixing of the Biard reveals the ideological workings in the original painting. The discomfort that the work produces in some viewers or reviewers is perhaps a necessary byproduct of this process. As I mentioned earlier, another referent anchors the piece in an exploration of the afterlife of slavery. The Attendant concludes with its protagonist singing Dido's lament from Purcell's Dido and Aeneas, and I'll just show you about a minute and a half of this. In the film's most arresting scene, the Attendant sings the lament in a tuxedo in the box of an opera house. The museum goer from the earlier scene now watches the Attendant from the mezzanine in a tuxedo and overcoat. On stage is a lush display of half-dressed men of different races, arranged at varying levels. They surround a bejeweled black man with a bare chest. He raises his arms dramatically to the ceiling as the Attendant sings on. Dido and Aeneas, written in the 17th century, describes Aeneas' journey to Carthage before going on to found Rome, but not before breaking the African queen's heart and driving her to suicide. The aria ends with the repetition of the phrase, remember me, but forget my fate," as Dido burns on the funeral pyre and Aeneas sets sail for other shores. Julien's linking of Dido's fate with Atlantic slavery is mirrored in theater scholar Joe Roach's account of the opera. He tells us, as Aeneas casts a parting look back to the rising pillar of smoke, his ambivalence fuses memory and forgetting into one gesture. In that gesture, he enacts the historic tendency of Europeans, when reminded to recall only emotions of deep love for the peoples whose cultures they have left in flames, emotions predicated on the sublime vanity that their early departure would not have been celebrated locally as deliverance. As an African queen, Dido's story stands in for many such scenes on the African coast, scenes in which the conquered languish and the conquering ships set sail forgetting. Julien's substitution of a gay black man for Dido introduces a mournful tone into the Attendant, though what is being mourned remains open-ended and unresolved. Julien provides one clue by telling us in his writing that the Attendant is married and closeted. Because the film shuttles between everyday life, which is shot mostly in black and white, and an imaginative landscape shot mostly in color, the Attendant reads as an attempt to mourn a type of sexual experience that isn't legible to the mainstream. In a review of the piece, Holland Cotter also attributes the film's poignant sense of loss to the fact that it was made at the height of the AIDS epidemic. Indeed, the Attendant sings his lament from the box, not the stage, suggesting that even in death, he's not the protagonist of his own story. This positioning mirrors the double erasure of black men who died of AIDS in the early 90s, in particular the enormous loss to the cultural sector that's marked only by their absence in the archive. However, I think the Attendant does its most powerful work by forcing a conversation between the history of slavery and the life of a contemporary black gay museum attendant. In suggesting that black S&M practitioners have developed a queer of color historiography, Elizabeth Freeman reminds us of the under-theorized power of pleasure to rework the relationship between contemporary subjects and collective history. In response to the Attendant's song, she says, "The intertwined sounds seem to implore these men of the past and the present, asking them to move across time and take up their obligations to one another. In keeping with the Marquis de Sade's antagonism towards inheritance, they asked the dead slaves to release any hold on their descendants that would later deny generations the capacity to recalibrate pain into pleasure. But then, too, in keeping with Benjamin's pursuit of a new collective memory forms, the sounds asked the living players never to confuse pleasure with historical amnesia. In other words, the attendant seems to posit a type of remembering that pricks but doesn't wound. This living historiography might begin to free its participants from both the power dynamics that oppressed their ancestors and from the limiting representations of slavery that followed. It might begin to enact a theory of Blackness centered on something other than trauma, passed down each generation to the next. To conclude, I want to begin to articulate my own investments in this work. Julien's film interpolates me as a diasporic subject in spite of the way it forecloses that possibility by figuring Blackness so specifically. Indeed, this interpolation remains true in spite of the fact that the artist takes up representations of Black women in slavery only to replace them with gay male surrogates. Memory, Joe Roach reminds us, is a process that relies crucially on forgetting. In the end, however, this work performs more than its component parts. To wit, this morning I performed the dangerous thought exercise of imagining my late father singing Dido's Lament to me. It's a risk to put this in a paper.
Yeah.
Remember me, but forget my fate. This is dangerous because it too risks erasure. It centers my experience in interpreting a work that isn't explicitly about me. But the exercise is also dangerous because it succinctly raises a question that's been on my mind in Cohate for months. Is it possible to hold the dead without being held back by them? In other words, if, as Saidiya Hartman tells us, the enslaved are our contemporaries, how do we get off this ship? The attendant doesn't answer this for us, and it certainly doesn't present a contemporary Black woman with a how-to manual on getting free. But I want to argue that for diasporic subjects, the most important takeaway here is not a rereading of the Biard. Centering the S&M-inflected sexual desire of the attendant allows Julien to assert the importance of Black subjects navigating their own relationship to the traumatic history of slavery, rather than passively accepting a historical common sense tacitly produced and reinforced by visual culture. The most important intervention might be the insistence that in our historical reading practice, we not reduce Black lives to Black deaths. This requires retracing historical steps in new and stylized ways. And perhaps it requires an attention to the Black body itself, its potential to both engage and release the traumatic memory of slavery. It asks that we embrace an embodied historiography, one that feels like pleasure as well as pain, and one that remembers and forgets in equal measure. Thank you.
And next we have Toby Sisson.
Good morning.
Morning.
First of all, like my fellow panelists, I want to thank Kimberly, Juanita Brown for creating this space and this opportunity to be with all of you. I'm very pleased to speak with you about one of my artworks and its connection to sonic scenes. I'll be talking about James Baldwin as my artistic ancestor, and really about one specific artwork. Though I'm a visual artist, I'm always seeking connections with other art forms. Poetry, along with music, operate in the realm that I find most compelling, abstraction, alluding to ideas and allowing the viewer, the listener, the reader, greater power over its interpretation. My own abstract paintings, drawings, and prints have found a special synergy with the poems of James Baldwin, particularly with the collection of his lesser-known verses, Jimi's Blues and Other Poems, republished in 2014 with a beautiful introduction by Nikki Finney. That year, 2014, also marked the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, an event that vividly recalled the brutality and loss that Baldwin wrote about throughout his life. the relationship between reading Baldwin's poems in the aftermath of the death of Michael Brown, as well as Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and later Sandra Bland and Philando Castile, among many others, was one of grief, yet fortitude for me, being steadfast in solidarity and resistance. Over time, I began to make artwork as an expression of that grief and opposition, the first of which were a series of small black tears, created as a repetitive act, an elegy for the loss of so much life. The black tears were simple, just black ink on white paper. Each was unique and became a ritual of mark-making that soon became an obsessive practice. To preserve the drawings, I coated each in purified beeswax, a stable and archival substance that never discolors or breaks down. The wax penetrates the surface of the drawing, making the paper translucent and sealing the image in a smooth, skin-like layer. Skin, like tears, evokes life and vulnerability in a poetic way. Initially, I didn't know what the outcome of my obsessive mark-making would be. It felt meditative and cathartic, but I hadn't yet become a coherent statement or a work of art. In time, I created so many tears, hundreds and hundreds of tears, in fact, that they needed to be exhibited in mass. And though each tear is individual, they express a sense of collective grief when massed together. Here's an oblique view of 385 black tears lining the wall of a gallery in Providence, Rhode Island. During their exhibition in 2015, I offered individual tears for sale at just $40 a piece. $20 for the gallery and $20 for me. And I did that so that the work could be shared with many people at an accessible price that I hoped would extend the idea of collectivity. Late last year, I exhibited Black Tears again in an exhibition titled The Soul of All Color, this time surrounded by the deepest blue-black, another small homage to Jimi's blues. So the tears were hung again, along with new works that represent Baldwin's words in new ways. The exhibition announcement shown here includes Jimi's Blues number 14. That's the image you see. It's one of a number of Jimi's Blues from another ongoing series. I'm continuing to create work based on concrete ideas expressed through abstract symbolic forms. As our colleague Kimberly Brown has said, abstraction assists the imagination by requiring something more of the viewer. That might be my favorite thing ever. In that spirit, I want to share a narrative, yet abstractly open poem from Jimi's Blues with you today. So I'll be reading Gypsy. Gypsy. He was standing at the bathroom mirror, shaving, had just stepped out of the shower, naked, balls retracted, prick limped out from the small morning hard-on, thinking of nothing but foam and steam. Then the bell rang. Not knowing why, for no reason, he touched his balls and he heard his wife Elizabeth call, "Coming." Then he heard the children, Joe, 5, Pam, 3. They had more or less been planned, giggling and conspiring at the breakfast table. They seemed to be happy and with more to say to each other than they had ever said to him. And then, as he tied the towel at his waist, he seemed to hear a kind of groaning in his house, a kind of moaning even. And he looked at himself in the mirror, and for no reason, he was suddenly afraid. He looked at himself, seeing the face he had always seen and never seen. Not a bad face, pink now from the steam, laboring through the fog of the mirror to be scrutinized, assessed one more time. No, not a bad face at all. Cheekbones high, a cleft in the chin, wide mouth, lips that loved to open, to suck, to close, to laugh, big straight teeth, broad, wide-nostriled nose, high forehead, curly black hair, the face of a gypsy Jew, and he was, indeed, Sephardic. He had loved Spain when he had walked and gawked there, years before he had become an American. Elizabeth now called him again, and he was afraid again, not knowing why, and angry at himself for not knowing why he was afraid. "Coming," he called again, and then in the bedroom, putting on his shorts, looking for a shirt, he called, "What is it?" And Elizabeth came into the bedroom, looking as nice as she always looked to him, and looking frightened. She said, "There are some men here to see you, from the FBI." "The FBI? That's what they said." He laughed. Then he got into his trousers. She helped him into his shirt. If that don't beat all. But he realized suddenly that Joe and Pam were not talking anymore, and Elizabeth abruptly left him. And he put on his shoes, he put on his watch. It said 8:30. He was to remember that. One was standing in the kitchen. One was standing in the living room. The one in the kitchen stood too close to the children. He did not like the way this man looked at his children. He did not like the way this man looked at Elizabeth. He did not like the way the man in the living room looked at his books, holding one in his hands as though it were reptilian, putting it down on the table as though the room were a swamp. Yet, if he had seen them on the train to work, in the streets, in a bar, he wouldn't have noticed them at all. They looked perfectly ordinary, dressed as safely as he was dressed, anonymous, and above all, democratic. "You are?" This was the one in the kitchen. It was not a question, it was a statement containing contempt. He felt the blood hit his temples. He put his hands in his pockets, trembling. He said, "What's this about?" But his voice was another man's voice. He did not recognize his voice. His voice. Now he realized he had never heard that voice. The one in the living room picked up another book, dropped it, said, "We're asking the questions, mister." Came into the kitchen and patted little Joe on the head. Joe jumped up and ran to his father, who put one trembling arm around him and said, "I think I have the right to ask questions. What are you doing in my house? What do you want?" They flashed badges. He said, "That don't mean shit." They laughed. Pam began to cry. Elizabeth went to her, staring at the men. "Oh, yes, it does," the living room man said, "and you are in it." The kitchen man laughed. He produced a photograph. He seemed to take it out of his hat, though his hat was on the kitchen table. "When did you last see this man, mister?" He wanted to say, "I don't know this man." He stared at the photograph of a man who had been his teacher once, a very fine man, a very fine teacher. His name was Stone. "I have not seen him in some time," he said, cold now and angry in another way, and too relieved to know what this was about, frightened to be, for the moment, anymore. Then the living room man said, "And you signed this?" and took out an old rolled up piece of paper, like a scroll, and thrust it at him. He read, "Genocide is among the American crimes, and we petition this nation to atone. He looked at this for a long time. He remembered signing it. He did not look for his name. He ran his hands through his son's abruptly electric hair and stared at the living room man and the kitchen man and said, "Yes, I signed it. You know that. Why are you here?" The kitchen man said, "Your teacher wrote a book too, didn't he?" He said yes, and then, not a bad book either. He was beginning to tremble. He wanted to laugh. He felt his son clasp his thigh. The living room man said, "Well, he's in jail, your teacher. He was a faggot commie spy." The kitchen man said, "I bet he made out with you. You, with your cute round ass. Yeah, that's why you signed this garbage." He willed his thigh not to tremble against his son's head. He said, "Why are you here?" And they said together, "We got some questions to ask you." Then Elizabeth asked, "Are you arresting my husband?" And they said together, "Yeah, come on, Buster, move it." Then he woke up. The doorbell rang. As an artist, I pay attention to affinities and alignments. Reading Baldwin while noticing the differences and similarities between him in his 60s and me in mine. In this way, I'm drawing on the wisdom of my artistic ancestors. They are ever present. As Baldwin said, "The poets, by which I mean all artists, are finally the only people who know the truth about us. Soldiers don't, statesmen don't, priests don't, union leaders don't, only the poets." That's my first proposition. The second proposition, and it sounds mystical, I think, in a country like ours and at a time like this, but something awful is happening to civilization when it ceases to produce poets. And what is even more crucial, when it ceases in any way, whatever, to believe in the report that only poets can make. Millions of people whom you will never see, who don't know you, never will know you, people who may try to kill you in the morning, live in a darkness which, if you have that funny, terrible thing that every artist can recognize and no artist can define, you are responsible to those people to lighten the darkness. This force which you didn't ask for, and this destiny which you must accept, is also your responsibility. And if you survive it, if you don't cheat, if you don't lie, it is not only your glory, your achievement, it is almost our only hope. Doesn't it feel like that could have been written today? So I leave you with one more sonic scene. The words of Baldwin that resonate with me most deeply and were placed on the wall at my first showing of Black Tears. The artistic image is not intended to represent the thing itself, but rather the reality of the force the thing contains. Thank you. And I left my water.
Amanda Wallace.
Good morning. Closer? Okay. Is this better? Yes. I might drift, so maybe let me know. I'm drifting, running away? No. Okay. So I did not print my paper, so I'm going to chuck through and I think I'll be fine. But thank you for being here, and also thank you, Kimberly, for, again, as I say, forcing me to do these types of things, which is good for me. So this presentation is kind of an extension of something that I have done before, in which I titled Interjections of Self. And I think I know that I'm trying to reevaluate the way that I represent myself in my work because of where I live currently, because I cannot produce work that I'm used to producing in the town that I'm living in. So I'm trying to reevaluate ways that I can represent self. I live in Northampton, which is a very white town, and I am not comfortable with doing the work that I normally do. So I'm reevaluating what I've done to hopefully move forward with new work. So the first piece that I will talk about is called Unpeeling, Unpiling. It is actually the first time-based work that I created, which is a long time ago to me, 9 years ago. And so within the piece, I hope that the sound plays. I'll play it first and then talk about it. It's meant to be black at first. Okay, so ideally this work would be listened to with headphones because the way that I've edited it, it's the sound shifts between the left and right ears, because my intention was to make it appear to represent how I think. Like, we have these voices in our head, and I solicited these words from people that I knew. I sent emails, texts, asking people to very uncomfortably give me a few words that described basically how they felt about me and how I presented myself. And so I wrote the words on pieces of tape and taped them fine, and it was a lot of words, and I actually taped it and then peeled it off. So my skin actually became raw at the end of the performance. And then I recorded myself basically interacting with the ball of tape because it was a way for me to remove myself or attempt to remove myself from the words that I was using to identify myself and also based on what others said about me. And I should backtrack and say that the work that I produced before this that involved myself, it's usually a portrait where there's no, I would say there's no content, it's just my face. There's no meaning, it's just a representation of my physical self. And I became annoyed with that because I did not want to just produce pretty pictures of myself. And so, oddly, with social media, I became more into that realm of producing work to show it as being visually appealing. And I think that's part of the draw of social media. And I titled this piece, this presentation, Arrhythmia's The Murmuring Between Selves, because I feel that we go in between these modes of representation. One, we want to be attractive, we want others to look at us, and there's other times when we want to retreat and to kind of be to ourselves. So the previous one was a retreat into self. And then post-Instagram, Untitled, number 1, when I see the title, I kind of laugh at myself, and I could have just titled it post-Instagram. But it's also a critique of fine art video works, because I created this piece with an app, so I didn't use any fancy editing software. But in it, I'm kind of critiquing the vanity that comes with social media, right? I post a video of myself doing very, you'll see. Also art. That's my, I need a haircut. It's fine. It's a very short video. So in it, I say it's also art because the next series of photos that you will see, I'm questioning whether or not what's posted on social media can be art. I agree that it can be because there are a lot of people who are performing. I don't know if they consider themselves performance artists, but if you think of memes, if you think of viral videos, that's what they're doing. They're dressing up in costume. Half of them might not even know about Cindy Sherman, but they are doing what she did. They're doing what Caleb Lindsay did. I don't know if he's still making his performance YouTube videos. But in this piece, I end by saying I need a haircut because there are these videos of masks, right? People putting on masks, self-care. I think there's an Instagram feed called The Cut Life. Can anyone confirm that? It's about haircuts that you can go on and find inspiration for. So I did this in 2015 when I wanted to remove myself from social media. So I produced the work, but I also wanted to remove myself from the social media practice. And then came this other series that I've been doing since maybe 2010, which I call Mobile Selves. Again, I'm trying to, I hope that I'm letting you know that I'm vacillating between these representations of self. So some of these are very, what I like to call a bit strange, but they're performances. So a lot of these props that I use were intentionally done to create a photo to post onto social media. So the top, it's cabbage, it's a cabbage leaf, and I use an app to merge two photos together to make them have that symmetry down the middle. Again, I don't know if some of you have seen the videos where, not the videos, the photos where you can, let's pretend it's like two of me and I'm on the other side and they merge. So I'm using that kind of app to do that. And this one, I did it for the new year. So in a way, I created a lunar selfie. Here I'm playing with my mother's pieces of wigs. This is a wig that my niece had for Halloween, and I decided to perform with that. Again, this is cabbage. I don't know why I was using cabbage leaves, but I think it's really about the textures and the colors. And then this was for Halloween. So a lot of these they seem a bit random, but I usually do them for certain holidays or celebrations. And here, there it is again. The merging, becoming a bit alien. And then this one. And here's the performance that we tend to see. And one more time, cabbage. My tongue is a cabbage, and then those are cinnamon rolls at the bottom. That day I actually cooked, and these are the components from the meal. This was for Halloween. Does anyone see the alien on the left side at the top? And for me, this one is like complete narcissism, right? I'm kissing myself. And then this one. So I never posted this one because I think it was too real. It was actually during a time that I was in the hospital for a recurring condition that I have. And I decided, I took the photo and I edited it with the usual apps that I use, but I decided not to post it because I felt that it was too real. And for me, why would I want to post something that's too real? I'd rather do these types of things. So now, moving on to this piece. So I shift from being vain back to thinking more critically about self. Morning Tea Extracted, I originally did it in 2011, and it's about 17 minutes long. And so I was not commissioned, but I applied for a show, and they told me that I could create something new. And so I decided to reevaluate this original piece, which is a single channel video, and to place it into 4 channels. The original piece, here's a still from it, had sound. The readaptation does not have sound. So I will play it. Hopefully you can see it. No sound. Okay, so the original piece with the sound is really about our continued conversation about hair texture. And so in it, there's an opening dialogue between 4 women discussing scientific and social implications of hair texture. But for this piece, I decided to, this adaptation, I chose to not include the sound because I wanted to see how I moved in the space and then what I could do in the future without sound. Because normally with my work, the way that I interject myself, it's my face or text that I write. And it was interesting for me to see my movements without any textual or sound element, because I think that even without sound, you can, at least when I watch it, I can get a sense of sound. And so now I'm going to end with 2 pieces which are very different because I'm not in them. And it's just a way for me to rethink how I can represent a self, not just myself. So this image, the netting is actually something used to block birds from gardens. And when I bought this for another work that I did, I draped it on the wall, and it became like a body to me. And so the shadows are actually a perfume bottle and then something that I had flowers in. So I'm interjecting femininity in the piece, but also I'm not there. So I find it interesting to think about the self in this way. And then here again, there's a draping, but there's no body. And so I think this is how I'm going to move forward. And even though arrhythmia might have a negative connotation, I'm interested in the way that we move in between selves, because we're all multiples, right? It's just a matter of owning it and being okay with how you represent yourself in the multiples. Good.
I don't sound good. Amah, Edoh. Hi, everyone. Hello. Kimberly's not here, but of course, thank you so much to Kimberly for creating the space and Thank you, Kimberly, in person, for creating the space. The first time I heard about the dark room, it just sounded like this mysterious, amazing place where this really important work was happening, and I desperately wanted to be connected to it. So it's with great delight that I'm here with you today. And thank you. These presentations were amazing and so moving and touching. So today what I'm going to do is share some thoughts with you about a direction in which my current work is going. So I'm not reading a paper, but I'll be sharing some of the research that I've done and some of the new ways that I'm trying to think about it. And I'm really excited and hoping that you will help me think about what to do with this. One of the reasons that I was particularly interested in connecting with the darkroom is because my work is in African studies, and I am deeply invested in figuring out how we can have more productive, maybe, conversations about Blackness across, Africa and the diaspora. And I'm because I think both personally as an African who is now also American, and also politically, intellectually, I think we have so much to gain from figuring out how to talk across from our different perspectives about points that are different but have a common agenda. So I think waxcloth is actually a really productive place to have that conversation, because it's an object that has been picked up, or that continues to be picked up in the diaspora for the ways that it signifies Africanness. So let's see where this goes. So my talk is titled Wax is the New Black, Cloth Skin and African Visibility in the Global. And essentially what I'm trying to do is to think about, what do these two images have in common? How do these two images actually illuminate a similar phenomenon? On the left is a picture that I took in the Paris metro. There was a woman who had this little tote that says, "Wax is the new black." The second image I took in Lomé, Togo, in West Africa, and it's an image of a skin bleaching cream. And the tagline says, "Glow white, even body, luminous skin tone, elegant skin." And so my research was partly in Holland, partly in Togo, because as you heard during the intro, I track the wax cloth made in Holland for West African markets. And so what I did was follow it from the design studio in Holland through marketing in Holland to Togo, which has been a historical marketplace, a hub for the distribution in West Africa. And so while I was in Togo, I was really struck by just how commonplace skin bleaching advertising was. Right, and I just want to give you a sense of that with I'll show you just a brief, this is a drive along Lomé is on the ocean, on the Atlantic Ocean, and the main market of Lomé is right on the ocean. And so this is just, I'll show you a minute of a drive along one of the main roads in Lomé of this market. I don't know if you can see the billboards, but just kind of pay attention to what's depicted on them. So here we have Cocoderm, note the image. Then we have Eclat White, which is the one I showed you earlier. Then we have one I can't see, Something Clear. Then we have yet another one whose name I can't see. And then we're coming upon a string of them back to back. So éclaircissant beauté means lightening beauty. Okay. So I saw these images all the time everywhere. And of course, there's a really high prevalence of skin bleaching. And there's a way that it's almost taken for granted. And we say, oh, this is a thing that happens. That was just deeply unsatisfying. It continues to be deeply unsatisfying to me. And I'm trying to think of ways to think through this practice. Now, my main work is on waxcloth. And so what I'm going to do is tell you about changes in the transformation in the Dutch waxcloth aesthetic that have happened over the past few years, and how I'm trying to link that to skin bleaching practices. Okay, so when we think about Dutch wax cloth, usually we think about it as, African print, right? And so whether it's in these kind of, these are images from my mom's schoolmates in Togo from the 60s, wearing the cloth. Or this other image that I got from the Togo tourism site, which shows you the significance that the cloth and the selling of the cloth has in Togo's image of itself and the idea it puts of itself out in the world, right? And so as African print cloth, wax cloth has been taken up in sort of Black beauty, Black civil rights movements, as well as in the, Wakanda moment, as a celebration of pride and excitement about our African heritage. Now, what a lot of people don't know or haven't known until relatively recently is that the cloth is not indigenous to West Africa, but it's actually a hybrid object, right? So it's a product of encounter between Southeast Asia, Europe, and West Africa. It's a product of the mechanization of the batik hand stamping technique from Indonesia, which the Dutch and other European producers mechanized. So they mechanized this technique in the late 19th century, initially in view of selling the cloth to Indonesian markets. Now, for a number of reasons, that didn't work out, and at the time they were trading in West Africa also, right? They had forts on the West African coast since the 16th century, and they found that there was a market for this cloth in West Africa, partly because the aesthetic of the Dutch wax cloth resonated with the aesthetic of textiles that were indigenous to the region, right? And so in the early 20th century, they started producing this cloth specifically for West African markets. And so this is the founder of the Dutch company, Vlisco, during one of his visits to the market to learn about customer preferences and so on. Now, once the cloth started being traded in West Africa, it was distributed by local networks of sellers who were Togolese and Ghanaian, first Ghanaian and then Togolese women, known as the Nana Bens. And they were known as the Nana Bens in Togo because Nana is a term of respect for older women, older important women, and Benz because they got so wealthy from their trade that they were actually the first owners of Mercedes-Benzes in Togo in the 1960s. And so they're known as the Nana Benz. And these women were responsible. They had their own networks of traders throughout West Africa. And so they would send feedback to the studio about what designs were working, how they should be changed, what colors people liked, and so on. But they would also send their own sketches to the studio that would then be translated by designers in Holland into printable designs, okay? And so this is an image of these Nana Benzes during one of their visits to Helmond in Holland. And so what we see is that what we've come to recognize as the distinctive Dutch wax cloth aesthetic is the product of the labor of these different groups, right? So on one hand, the Dutch designers, on the other hand, of course, the Indonesian underlying batik aesthetic, and then these West African women who themselves were taking up the aesthetic preferences of a range of West African and Central African consumers, right? So all of that labor has gone into producing what we know as wax print cloth. Now, in 2006, the company, the Dutch wax manufacturer Vlisco, launched a rebranding initiative. Essentially, for a number of reasons, the West African market was now flooded with Chinese manufactured wax cloth, and Vlisco no longer had the monopoly that it had on this market. And so they had to revise their strategy. And the Chinese-made cloth costs as little as 1/10 of the Dutch wax, and the standard length of Dutch wax is equivalent to the average monthly salary in Togo. Okay, so one piece of cloth is equal to 1 month's salary. So, and I can talk more about how all that came about, but essentially the Dutch wax became completely unaffordable for most people. So they had to rethink their strategy. And their strategy was to remake themselves from a manufacturer of textiles for Africa into a global design and fashion brand. Okay? And so here we see some of their advertising images communicating this new brand identity. So we see them here, and we see them here, in the ways that's sort of like the vision of the company for what it meant to become global and to go beyond producing for Africa specifically. Okay. Now, what that meant is that, so it's easy to, not easy, but it's clear when we look at it in brand communication images, but what I found in my research is that this rebranding played out not only at the level of the brand identity, but even at the level of the designs themselves. Okay? So this is a picture from the 50s of the design studio at Vlisco. And so here you see designers who are reproducing old batik designs. So essentially the way that it worked for the first until the 1980s at the company is that designers would come in, usually as teenagers, and then they would spend 5 years copying Indonesian batik designs or completing the designs of more experienced designers. Okay, so 5 years literally every day going and reproducing these designs. Now, with the rebranding at the company, what happened is that instead of this apprenticeship model, the new designers who came in were hired straight out of art or design schools. And so they were trained either in illustration or graphic design or other forms of, or textile design. And they started designing instantly. The idea there was that they were experts, they were trained in design, they were skilled designers, and that they could bring that to freshen up the brand. Now, what that meant is that they were trained, yes, but they were trained in something different, right? So they came with different skilled vision, skilled vision and techniques of the body even, right? So even though they were trained designers, they did not know how to see wax cloth, and they did not know how to recognize, how to reproduce that aesthetic, right? So then, as a result of that, and linked to that, not only were who was hired as a designer different, but the ways that collections were produced were different. So whereas before, as I mentioned, these West African sellers were integral to the design process, so they intervened very early on and said, no, we don't want this, and keep moving this design forward and so on. Now the way the design works is that it's collection-based, and the theme of the collections is articulated by the head of design who bases them on trends in fashion and design in global centers like Paris, Milan, and New York. Yeah? And so here what we see are palettes and sort of inspiration images for the collection that I followed. That was Fantasia, and it was supposed to be kind of a crazy collection. So the creative director shows these inspirations or his mood board to the designers, and then they go to see what sketches they have in progress, and then they move those designs along. And once those designs are almost completed, then West African sales reps are brought in, and they can offer feedback to tweak designs, right? So they're intervening much later in the process. And so we go from this aesthetic, which is kind of what we recognize as wax cloth, to this aesthetic, which is what what the new designs that have been coming out of the studio have been looking at. And so, I'm trained as an anthropologist in science and technology studies, and part of the reason I've been, so desperate to connect with Darkroom is that I want to figure out how to think about these visual objects, because the key to this puzzle is in the images themselves, right? And I want to be able to work with the images. And what was striking is that when I was in Lomé, a longtime seller of this cloth was saying, the designs, it's nice to have innovation and to have changes in the designs, yeah? But the problem is that people don't see themselves in the designs anymore. So in French, he said, les gens ne se retrouvent plus dans les dessins. And se retrouver in French means both to see oneself and to find one's way through. So what he was saying effectively is that, in the old aesthetic, which is represented by the design to the left, there's a way that people saw themselves and were represented in it. And if we think about what I've talked about in terms of how the designs came about, we understand how that was, right? That consumers' tastes were brought into it. Whereas now, it's just not giving them that same feedback, partly because they're no longer involved in the process. And so the way that I'm trying to link this to skin bleaching, it might seem like a stretch, but I actually don't think it's a stretch, is that if we think about fabric, dress has been theorized as a form of social skin, yeah? And cloth, obviously, as a part of dress, is a form of social skin. And I think that what's happening essentially with this, the Dutch wax aesthetic, is that there is a reworking of the skin itself, if you think about it as a skin, of the skin itself in order to negotiate sort of African, transform African into global, yeah? And that sounds kind of familiar. I mean, to me, that sounds not unlike what happens or what happens through skin bleaching. And to me, it's really striking that that condition of participation or inclusion or recognition or visibility is a transformation of the look of the thing itself, whether at the level of our corporeal skin or at the level of social skin, what we, the dress we put on our skin. And so, perfect. And so, I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, and so what I'm trying to do here is, I was struck by this when I saw Wax is the New Black. I didn't know why I was struck by it, but I was like, there's something really powerful here. And the thing is that in this brand, so this is you can buy these online. This is a little shop on Etsy or somewhere online. But here, black is being taken up as a sense of like common or the new normal, right? So wax is so common, wax is cool, now it's the new black, it's a new norm. But what I'm trying to do in linking skin bleaching to the Dutch wax aesthetic is to take up black as it relates specifically to skin and race, where it's all but, the new normal. And in fact, it's something that needs to be, in this case, if you think about wax as the new black, the same ways that blackness, black skin, black race has to be reworked and erased, we see some of the same dynamics playing out at the level of the cloth. So this is a tenuous, I don't think it's tenuous, but this is the link that I'm trying to do, and it's the direction that I'm trying to take this particular chapter that I'm working on. So I'm excited to hear some of your thoughts and feedback on that. Thank you.
So we have about 4 minutes for questions and answers, unless Kimberly gives us a little more. Okay, thank you. And so I'd just like to thank you, ladies, for your fascinating work. I work in education and nonprofits, and it tends to be it is a place where deficits are the focus, and it really looks at how communities of color are problematic. And so this is refreshing for me to be in a space where we are looking at the complexities of Black lives and Black aesthetic, and taking it from a point of our lived realities and not someone's stereotype of who we are. So thank you. Thank you very much. It's great. You have any questions? Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for this panel. It's really wonderful. I do have a question for the last paper, Professor Edoh. I like this connection very much that you want to make between Dutch wax and the skin bleaching, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of the computer in the design and the role of computation, perhaps in changing the look of, it's too late, changing the look of Dutch wax.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So the role of the computer in all of this, it's part of it, but it doesn't explain everything. So and it's something that I want to kind of dig into more. So this company started using computers in the 90s, which was at about the same time that all wax they were at the time in Britain also, and then in China, all wax manufacturers started using computers. Yet this change in aesthetic did not happen at that point, right? This change happened really when new designers were hired and the configuration of design practice was changed. So the tools matter, but what some senior designers who've been in the studio since the 70s say is that it's not just about the tools. Yeah, some of them say, I don't use computers, computers suck. But it's about the time that you take, it's about the way that you design, it's about the way that you move your body with that. And that's something that's embodied, and that's something that you learn with time and with practice. So the tool, will always have an effect on what you produce, but it doesn't alone explain the output. And so these other things that come into it are part of what I'm trying to bring out.
So I'm gonna ask you to speak into the microphone so it will be picked up on the video.
Thank you. These were all fascinating. And I too have a question for the last presenter. Can you talk a little bit about the role of Chinese producers? And I'm just wondering what their relationship is with the African designers.
Yeah, good question. So I don't know very much about how the Chinese companies work because so all wax manufacturers are actually very closed, and I was very lucky to get in, which is what I'm worried about when I publish this stuff. But all the designing, so there's at least one Chinese company that has its studio that bought up the former British company, but their designers are also in Europe and are also European. So in the Dutch case, the designers are European. There's some wax cloth design that happens in Africa, in Ghana, in Accra, and that's the Ghana GTP, Ghana Textile Printing, and their designers are Ghanaian. And there's Chinese-owned factories in Nigeria and other places. So yeah, I mean, I can't tell you a whole lot about who those people are, but in some cases, at least, I know the design is still in Europe. And there's some designing happening in Africa, but it's not always wax cloth. Sometimes it's essentially a photocopy. So it's a different production technique and different quality level.
Hi, my question is also for the last presenter. Sorry, from the art history major that I am actually in, I can help myself asking about the artist application of Dutch wax and all kinds of African types of fabric, like Inca Shonibare. And Inca Shonibare,
yep.
yes. And I'm just wondering, since this Chinese factory coming into this business is news to me, I was just wondering that still the wax prints represent the African originality, because it has been started from the Indonesia and went to the Dutch wax company in East India, the production company, and then also now it's the Chinese company came into that market. So I'm just wondering why we still have to cling on to this originality of the African wax fabric, because if it is about the erasing the identity from that fabric and also from the African identity or originality, would it be not the exact thing that we need to cling on to, because it's already been very much mixed together with other traditions?
Yeah, so that was actually the starting place for my doing this research, because I'm Togolese and I refuse to give this up. I refuse, because to me this is part of my heritage, and this is part of what it means for me to be a Togolese person, a Togolese woman, a West African. And I don't think that I don't like authenticity as a term, but I don't think that the cultural value of an object has to be tied to its origin. And so what looking at different forms of labor does is that it allows us to think of consumption as a form of labor that goes into what gives an object its value. So in this case, it's not even that West Africans or Central Africans were only users, right? Because we see that they're also involved in the design process. But even if we had only been users, the love that we've put into this object, that we have invested in it generation after generation, is what has given these companies, that has made them be able to exist, right? And is what has given this object value. And that's what makes it ours. And because of that, and the companies have had to take our tastes into account in developing them until now. And so that's why it's ours. And so, you do bring up an important point about what do we do at this point, right? When the object no longer represents us or embodies our labor, do we still claim it? And so I personally have a hard time. I don't buy the new designs because I don't like them, and they don't mean anything to me. They don't resonate with me. I wear old designs that my mother, so that's how I'm dealing with it. But I think that wax cloth as an object we do not need to give up as Africans or as Black people, right? I think it's still. But we also, and that doesn't need to be predicated on a fantasy of it being an original or indigenous African thing, because it's not. But so much that we wear and that we consider to be part of what makes us who we are is not from our, where we are from,
So I wanted to thank you for talking about the Black girl play, the Camille Brown work. I saw it and I loved it, and I was sitting beside, bought my ticket by myself and happened to be sitting beside a Black academic, and we talked, ended up talking about it. So I felt like it brought it. I went to when it was at Jacob's Pillow in Western Mass, but I wanted to know whether or not you interacted with. I know you spoke with the dancers, but whether or not you talked to some of the audience members, because I felt like particularly in the audience, it had a really strong impact. And for other people, I'm wondering about the role of play in your work.
you know, in different ways. I mean, yeah, so the role of play in people's work more generally, even sometimes when you're talking about pain or tears or sex and play, or, you know, so thinking about that.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. You know, one of the things I really appreciate, and that was sometimes hard to watch, is that the second act of the show is actually a conversation. It's not like a talk back, it's like the second act of the show, where everyone comes on stage, and Camille is very clear about wanting a Black female identified person to moderate that conversation. And it's a moment where it's both beautiful because you see folks having to interpret what they think they saw, and also painful because you also witness the kind of poverty of language around being able to talk about Black girlhood. And some of the responses, you know, she talks about this moment where someone is just like, that was so moving because I could just see, like, the girls were just trying to, like, get out the ghetto. And it's like literally opposite day. Like, you know, like just like a moment where it's like, oh wow. So there are these moments that are not just like, wow, that's absurd, but it's also, you know, those moments of kind of like, those moments that we might think of wild really are indicative of the kind of the lack of grammar that we have to even be able to understand what we think we saw, and also how our seeing Black girls is so oftentimes over-determined from without, right? That there's already a narrative that's in front of the choreography. That is a long way to say, yes, talking to people after the performances has been incredibly helpful, but also taking meticulous notes and talking to the choreographer and dancers after those talkbacks is also really instructive, because it tells us, well, there's one thing to make Black feminist performance, but the language it doesn't always catch up with the work that's being produced.
I wanted to thank you all for a really rich set of conversations, and picking up on, Jasmine, what you were calling a politics of tenderness. I wondered if you and perhaps some of the other panelists could talk a little bit about what the politics of tenderness would look like as a method or a methodology. Because tenderness, I think, is something that ran right through the papers, whether it was Christina speaking when invoking your father, or James Baldwin's poetry, or Amanda, your decision to show us a photograph that you didn't upload, and of course in the last paper about the family photograph that you showed of your mother wearing the Dutch wax cloth. So I wondered if there was a way in which this politics of tenderness was actually a kind of methodology of doing visual cultural studies, Black visual cultural studies.
Yeah, and so again, reading minds. I wanted also to push on the politics of tenderness, because one of the things I was struck by is the particular kind of physicality and embodiment of the Camille Brown pieces, and so I was curious about tenderness. While I know what you mean, and I understand it in relationship to what is being talked about around the table, but I was thinking, why tenderness and not something like intimacy, right? Because there's a juxtaposition between the physicality of the gestures and the embodiments that Camille Brown's group are doing that don't necessarily look tender, but are about a politics of care. Do you know what I mean? And so that it's more about the establishment of the relationship of intimacy through, through slaps, through punches, through all those other things. And so the tenderness to me, just the particular selection of the term, and I wanted to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both. For me, I am really thinking of a kind of so for me, a Politics of Tenderness is actually a performance, like it is a rehearsal strategy. It is a way to make choreography. It's a way to be alongside and within a company, right, within a dance company. And in the larger work, I talk about those rehearsals. And how, you know, for me, the tenderness is both something that we can see on stage, but it's also something that is prefigured before that performance work, right? That the performance is only made available because of that labor of tenderness in the rehearsals. And so tenderness for me is actually like less about a kind of always softness, right? It's less about being plush and more about being inside out. That the tenderness is what the participants are deciding to be, and that is really available, really raw, and that comes in the hand, like the force in the hand games, the force in the stomping and the clapping, the grit of it, right? That is also tender for me. And part of what I'm saying, drawing on Clark Hine, and I think it's really interesting that Camille does too, is that we have this culture of dissemblance, which is like a performance of being okay. And a Politics of Tenderness for me is about being honest about the fact that we may or may not be. And that kind of ambiguity, that kind of walking around as available but not a bruise, is why tenderness for me and maybe not intimacy.
I think about tenderness, but I think what you touched on about intimacy is probably closer in my work. I'm often thinking about vulnerability. That becomes a really strong force, but probably mostly vulnerability to self. I understand the risk involved with being vulnerable to an antagonist or really exposing yourself in certain ways, but I found an enormous amount of vulnerability in Baldwin's poetry, and I found that became a catalyst and a sort of a liberating tool for me to be vulnerable with myself in the studio in a way that I think I hadn't been. I think I was intellectualizing things in my work previously, and I've allowed myself to feel a little bit more and to be vulnerable, and actually to find some strength in that vulnerability in a strange, almost paradoxical way.
I've been sort of playing with the term that this artist, Jamil Kasako, if you don't know his work, check it out. He's a genius. But he came and did a workshop with my students, and he talked about developing or cultivating a virtuosity of empathy, and what kind of work one has to employ to do that. And I think I've always had an easier time doing that in an arts practice than I have in academic work, and that's in part because we're always, trying to cultivate this mastery, and I'm an art historian, and as a field, it's a very prickly, Eurocentric, anti-Black, et cetera, space. And so the first time I gave this talk, it was at College Art Association, and I decided, I've told some of you this before, that when I'm making art, I always write "tell the truth" at the top of the page, and I decided to start doing that with my academic work. So as part of the method of cultivating a virtuosity of empathy, I was like, you have to become vulnerable to an audience of people who may attack you. But I found, just like I guess Toby, that I think it opened up something very different and something very real, and it allowed other people to feel in that space too. So there's something really powerful about that work.
Sorry. So you mentioned the last image that I showed and why the one that I didn't upload. So ironically, although we saw several images of myself on the screen, I don't reveal too much internal things. The first piece that I showed, the unpeeling, unpiling, that video I think is the most intimate to work. I also write, but I don't share that. I don't post that because to me that's I keep that. The other half of my work is documenting my family, and most times when I'm photographing them, I'm actually searching for vulnerable moments because I don't recall seeing them growing up. And so as I photograph them, I'm seeking something that I didn't see growing up. It's not to say that they weren't tender towards each other, because we care for each other, we do things to help one another, but there's not touch. You know, it's, I do this for you, you need this, but I'm not going to hug you, I'm not going to kiss you. But I'm looking for those moments, hopefully in my photographs, that I don't see just watching them, but with my camera, I'm trying to see that. And then whenever I get back to making work that shows myself, hopefully it will come across. But I'm kind of still at this little standstill of being extra vulnerable with my own presentation, I should say.
And with that, we'd like to thank the panelists once again.